Tasmania is an island state of Australia, sitting about 240 kilometers south of the mainland, with the Bass Strait lying between them. The state isn't just the main island, which is the 26th largest in the world, but also includes around 1,000 smaller islands surrounding it. Back in time, during the last glacial period, roughly 11,700 years ago, Tasmania was actually connected to mainland Australia. People first made their way to Tasmania around 40,000 years ago, using a land bridge that existed during the last glacial period. Genetic evidence shows that after the sea levels rose, flooding what was known as the Bassian Plain, the island's population became isolated for about 8,000 years, staying that way until European explorers arrived in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. For a long time, it was believed that Tasmania had only been inhabited relatively recently. However, that changed in the 1980s when 19,000-year-old artifacts were discovered at Truganini Cave, proving that people had lived in the highlands during the Ice Age. Then, in 1990, archaeologists made another significant find at Warreen Cave in the Maxwell River Valley, revealing that Aboriginal Tasmanians had been living there as early as 34,000 years ago. This made them the southernmost population in the world during the Pleistocene era. Tasmania got its name from the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, who was the first European to spot the island on November 24, 1642. Initially, Tasman named it Anthony van Diemen's Land, in honor of his sponsor, Anthony van Diemen, who was the governor of the Dutch East Indies. Later, the British shortened the name to Van Diemen's Land. It wasn't until January 1, 1856, that the island was officially renamed Tasmania, paying tribute to its first European discoverer. The island's early history saw it colonized by waves of Aboriginal people from southern Australia during glacial maxima, periods when sea levels were at their lowest. The archaeological and geographic records suggest that during these colder glacial periods, a drying trend created a desert that extended from southern Australia into Tasmania's midlands. However, there were intermittent periods of warmer and wetter climate. As these migrants made their way from southern Australia to what is now Tasmania, they would have crossed both stretches of seawater and desert, eventually finding refuge in the King Highlands, which served as oases. When the sea levels rose again, creating the Bass Strait, Tasmania became separated from mainland Australia, cutting off the Aboriginal people who had migrated there from their mainland relative. Archaeological evidence suggests that populations in the King Inferno Highlands were stranded by the rising waters and eventually died out. The Tasmanian Aboriginal people lived in all types of environments across the island. They particularly focused on coastal areas around the entire island, as well as the drier, less rugged areas in the central lowlands. Interestingly, there aren't many archaeological finds from the last 10,000 years of the Holocene period in the wet and rugged western interior of Tasmania. However, evidence from the earlier Pleistocene period shows that this western interior was more heavily occupied during the last Ice Age. In traditional Tasmanian Aboriginal culture, women played a crucial role in food gathering, handling about 80% of the task. They stayed closer to home, taking care of the children while diving for oysters, clams, and abalones. The men, on the other hand, went on multi-day hunting trips, targeting larger animals like kangaroos. For hunting, they often used a tool known as a donker, or shusher, which is essentially a long, thick club made from a small gum tree. The process of crafting these weapons is done with care. They cut the tree in a way that allows it to regrow, and the leaves from the tree are kept for medicinal purposes and other uses. Resourcefulness is at the heart of their hunting practices. Every part of the animal is utilized to ensure nothing goes to waste. For example, the stomachs of kangaroos, wallabies, and other animals are repurposed as water carriers, while intestines are used to store ochre. Kangaroo stomach acid, which is more acidic than a human's, is employed to clean shells for making jewelry. The spines of echidnas, along with kangaroo bones and sinews, are used to poke holes in these shells, which are also used for sewing. Possum blankets, for instance, are crafted to protect against the cold, with each person receiving their first opossum skin at birth, and additional skins are added as they grow. By making full use of their hunting spoils and the plants around them, the Aboriginal people led a lifestyle that was far less work-centered. They spent only about 2 to 4 hours a day on essential tasks: food gathering, fire, and shelter. Plants were just as important as hunting in their daily lives, if not more so. They found a use for nearly every native plant, whether for food, medicine, crafting, or even as indicators of seasonal changes. For example, sag, also known as lamandra, was a staple food, Its white base, which tastes like snow peas, could be ground into flour. A handful of native cherries served as a sweet treat and were packed with vitamin C, comparable to an entire orange. These cherries weren't just for eating. They crushed the flowers into a paste that worked as a coagulant, and the wood from the trees was used to make ceremonial clapstick. When harvesting these cherries, they would shake the trees and catch what fell in their possum blankets, leaving the rest on the trees for birds and other animals to eat. Seaweed was another versatile resource. It was used to carry water and added iodine to it, enhancing its nutritional value. Plants also served as visual cues for understanding seasonal and life cycle. For example, the flowering of certain wattle seed signaled the wallaby birthing season, a crucial time when they would avoid hunting to help sustain the wallaby population. This deep knowledge of their environment and respect for nature allowed them to live in harmony with the land. When Abel Tasman first landed in Tasmania, he didn't encounter any of the Aboriginal Tasmanians. It wasn't until 1772 that another European, French explorer Marion Dufresne, made contact during his expedition. Initially, the interaction with the Aboriginal people was friendly, but things took a turn when a second boat was sent toward the shore. This alarmed the Aboriginal Tasmanians, who reacted by throwing spears and stones. The French responded with musket fire, which resulted in the death of at least one Aboriginal person and injuries to several others. Later on, two other French expeditions led by Bruni d'Entrecasteaux in 1792 to 1793 and Nicolas Baudin in 1802 managed to establish friendly contact with the Aboriginal Tasmanians, with d'Entrecasteaux's crew even spending an extended period of time with them. More extensive contact between Aboriginal Tasmanians and Europeans began when British and American seal hunters started frequenting the islands in Bass Strait, as well as the northern and eastern coasts of Tasmania in the late 1790s. By around 1800, it became common for sealers to stay on uninhabited islands in Bass Strait during the sealing season, which lasted from November to May. These sealers set up semi-permanent camps or settlements on the islands, close enough to the main island of Tasmania that they could reach it in small boats and interact with the Aboriginal Tasmanians. This led to the development of trading relationships between the sealers and the Tasmanian Aboriginal tribes. Hunting dogs became highly valued by the Aboriginal people, along with other exotic items such as flour, tea, and tobacco. In return, the Aboriginal people traded kangaroo skins for these goods. However, the trade also took a darker turn as a market for Aboriginal women emerged. Many Tasmanian Aboriginal women were adept at hunting seals and gathering other foods like seabirds. Some Tasmanian tribes traded the services of these women and occasionally men to the sealers for the seal hunting season. Unfortunately, some women were sold on a permanent basis, and this trade included not only women from the trading tribes, but also those abducted from other tribes. In some cases, women were given to the sealers as a means of incorporating the new arrivals into Aboriginal society through marriage. The sealers were not always peaceful. They often raided coastal areas to abduct Aboriginal women, and were reported to have killed Aboriginal men during these raids. By 1810, the seal populations had been greatly diminished due to overhunting, leading most seal hunters to leave the area. However, a small number of sealers, around 50, mostly renegade sailors, escaped convicts or ex-convicts, remained as permanent residents of the Bass Strait Islands. Some of these sealers established families with Tasmanian Aboriginal women, forming a unique and complex community in the region. The raids for and trade in Aboriginal women had devastating effects on the population of Aboriginal women in northern Tasmania. By 1830, only 3 women were left in northeast Tasmania among 72 men. This stark gender imbalance significantly contributed to the decline of the full-blooded Aboriginal population in Tasmania. However, out of this dark period, a mixed-race community emerged on the islands of Bass Strait, where it continues to exist today. Many modern-day Aboriginal Tasmanians trace their ancestry back to these 19th-century sealer communities, reflecting the complex and often painful history of European contact with the Aboriginal people of Tasmania. Sealers and whalers began setting up on Tasmania's islands as early as 1798. In August 1803, the governor of New South Wales, Philip King, took action to prevent the French, who had been exploring the southern coast of Australia, from making claims on the island. He sent Lieutenant John Bowen to establish a small military outpost on the eastern shore of the Derwent River. Bowen's party included 49 people, among them 21 male and 3 female convicts. few months later, Captain David Collins set up a second settlement about 5 kilometers south of Bowen's outpost, at Sullivan's Cove on the western side of the Derwent, where fresh water was more abundant. This settlement grew to be known as Hobart Town. However, life in Sullivan's Cove was far from easy. Severe food shortages plagued the settlement, and by 1806, the inhabitants were starving. Many had to resort to scraping seaweed off rocks and scavenging washed-up whale blubber from the shore just to survive. In October 1804, another smaller colony was established at Port Dalrymple on the Tamar River in the island's north. Several other convict-based settlements followed. By 1819, population of Aboriginal people and British colonists reached about 5,000 each, though the ratio of men to women among the colonists was stark, with men outnumbering women 4-1. The arrival of free settlers in large numbers began around 1820, attracted by the promise of land grants and access to free convict labor. The settlement of the island's northwest corner was largely controlled by the Van Diemen's Land Company, which sent its first surveyors to the area in 1826. By 1830, Van Diemen's Land had become a significant part of the Australian colony, with 1/3 of Australia's non-Indigenous population living on the island. The island also accounted for about half of all land under cultivation and exports in Australia at that time. Tensions between Tasmania's Aboriginal people and European settlers escalated sharply, largely due to the growing competition for kangaroo and other game. In 1810, explorer and naval officer John Oxley observed the many atrocious cruelties inflicted on Aboriginal people by convict bushrangers in the north, which provoked retaliatory attacks on isolated white hunters. The arrival of 600 colonists from Norfolk Island between 1807 and 1813 exacerbated these hostilities. These settlers established farms along the River Derwent and around Launceston, occupying about 10% of Van Diemen's Land. By 1824, the colonial population had swelled to 12,600, and the island's sheep population had reached 200,000. This rapid colonization transformed traditional kangaroo hunting grounds into farmland, marked by grazing livestock, fences, hedges, and stone walls. The government responded by increasing police and military patrols to control the convict laborers on these farms. From the mid-1820s, violence between the settlers and Aboriginal people escalated rapidly, a period that would come to be known as Black War. Driven by hunger, which now included a desire for agricultural produce, and anger over the abduction of their women and girls, Aboriginal people began to attack settlers. New settlers, driven by fear, carried out defensive operations and sometimes even launched preemptive strikes against the Aboriginal population. The gender imbalance in Van Diemen's Land was extreme, with male colonists outnumbering females 6-1 in 1822 and 16-1 among the convict population. Historian Nicholas Clements has argued that the settlers' voracious appetite for native women was a significant trigger for the explosion of violence in the late 1820s. Between 1825 and 1828, the number of attacks by Aboriginal people more than doubled each year, creating widespread panic among settlers. During the summer of 1826 to 1827, clans from the Big River, Oyster Bay, and North Midlands nations began spearing stockkeepers on farms, making it clear that they wanted the settlers and their livestock to leave their kangaroo hunting ground. Settlers responded with force, leading to many mass killings. In November 1826, Governor Sir George Arthur issued a notice allowing colonists to kill Aboriginal people if they attacked settlers or their property. In the following 8 months, more than 200 Aboriginal people were killed in the settled districts in retaliation for the deaths of 15 colonists. By the end of another 8 months, the death toll had risen to 43 colonists and likely 350 Aboriginal people. In April 1828, Governor Arthur issued a proclamation of demarcation, which forbade Aboriginal people from entering the settled districts without a government-issued passport. Later that year, in November, he declared martial law in the colony, a state that remained in force for over 3 years, the longest period of martial law in Australian history. In November 1830, Governor Arthur launched the Black Line campaign, ordering every able-bodied male colonist to join a massive drive to push the Aboriginal people out of the settled regions and onto the Tasman Peninsula. This campaign, however, failed and was abandoned after 7 weeks. By that time, Tasmania's Aboriginal population had plummeted to around 300 people. In late 1831, George Augustus Robinson brought the first group of 51 Aboriginal Tasmanians to a settlement on Flinders Island. Unfortunately, this location was far from ideal. The settlement was exposed to harsh gales, had very little access to water, and the land was unsuitable for growing crops. Supplies to the settlement were insufficient, and if it hadn't been for the sealers who provided potatoes, the Aboriginal people would likely have starved. The Europeans at the settlement were subsisting on oatmeal and potatoes, but the Aboriginal people, who found oatmeal unpalatable, survived mainly on potatoes and rice, supplemented by mutton birds they caught. Tragically, within just a few months, 31 of the Aboriginal residents had died. By January 1832, another 44 captured Aboriginal people had been brought to the settlement, and tensions arose between different tribal groups. Just 2 weeks later, the Aboriginal people moved back to the lagoons, where they could secure a more reliable food supply and were allowed to go on hunting trips. Later that year, in October, a decision was made to build a new camp with better structures, using wattle and daub, at a more suitable location known as Pea Jacket Point. This place was renamed Civilization Point, became more commonly referred to as the Wybalenna Aboriginal Establishment. The name Wybalenna, meaning dwellings in the Ben Lomond language, is often translated as black man's houses. Robinson, who had befriended Truganini and learned some of the local language, managed to persuade the remaining 154 full-blooded Aboriginal people to move to the new settlement on Flinders Island in 1833. He promised them a modern and comfortable environment and assured them they would be returned to their homeland on the Tasmanian mainland as soon as possible. At the Wybalenna Aboriginal Establishment, they were provided with housing, clothing, food rations, medical services, and education. Convicts were assigned to build the housing and tend the vegetable gardens, doing most of the work required to sustain the settlement. Upon their arrival, all Aboriginal children aged between 6 and 15 were separated from their families, be raised by the storekeeper and a lay preacher. Despite the hardships, the Aboriginal people retained some freedom, often leaving the settlement for extended hunting trips, as the rations provided were inadequate. However, by 1835, conditions at Wybalenna had deteriorated so badly that Robinson himself took over the management of the settlement, improving the food supply and the housing conditions. Sadly, of the 220 Aboriginal people who arrived at Wybalenna, most died over the next 14 years due to diseases introduced by the settlers and inadequate shelter. The loss of their traditional way of life and freedom also resulted in an extremely low birth rate, and few children survived past infancy. By the late 1830s, the conditions at the Wybalenna Aboriginal Establishment on Flinders Island had become dire, and the settlement was increasingly viewed as a failure, despite George Augustus Robinson's claims of improvement. In 1839, Governor Sir John Franklin appointed a board to investigate the situation at Wybalenna. The board's findings rejected Robinson's optimistic reports and revealed the harsh realities of the settlement: poor living conditions, inadequate supplies, and the devastating impact on the Aboriginal population. However, the report was never publicly released, and the government continued to promote Wybalenna as a successful model for the treatment of Aboriginal people. In March 1847, 6 of the remaining Aboriginal residents at Wybalenna took a bold step by petitioning Queen Victoria. This petition was historic, as it was the first time an Aboriginal group in Australia had formally appealed to the reigning monarch. Petitioners requested that the promises made to them be honored, reflecting their growing despair and disillusionment with the conditions they were enduring. Later that year, in October 1847, the 47 surviving Aboriginal people at Wybalenna were relocated to Oyster Cove, a former convict station near Hobart. The journey itself was tragic, with only 44 surviving the trip. Upon arrival, the children were immediately separated from their families and sent to the orphan school in Hobart, further fracturing the already diminished community. Although the housing and food at Oyster Cove were somewhat better than at Wybalenna, the station was far from ideal. It had been abandoned earlier that year due to health issues related to its location on poorly drained mudflats, which only compounded the suffering of the Aboriginal residents. As the years passed, population at Oyster Cove continued to dwindle. By 1859, only a dozen or so Aboriginal people remained, and by 1869, just one survivor, Truganini, was left. Truganini, often regarded as the last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal person, passed away in 1876, marking the end of an era. The plight of the Oyster Cove people attracted international scientific interest from the 1860s onward, particularly from those in the field of physical anthropology. Researchers and museums sought out Aboriginal Tasmanian body parts, including skulls, for study and display. These scientists hoped to gain insights into human evolution and paleoanthropology through the study of Aboriginal Tasmanian remains. This morbid interest led to the widespread collection and dispersal of Aboriginal body parts, often taken from graves or even the bodies of those who had been murdered. Truganini herself was deeply troubled by the prospect of her body being exploited after her death. Tragically, her fears were realized when, 2 years after her passing, her body was exhumed and sent to Melbourne for scientific study. Her skeleton was then displayed publicly at the Tasmanian Museum until 1947. A grim reminder of the colonial exploitation of Aboriginal people. It was not until 1976, a full century after her death, that Truganini's remains were finally laid to rest through cremation. The dispersal of Aboriginal Tasmanian body parts, often taken without consent or respect, has long been a source of pain and anger for their descendants. In many Aboriginal belief systems, the soul can only find peace when laid to rest in its homeland. The removal and display of these remains have been seen as a profound violation of this spiritual principle, adding to the long history of suffering endured by the Tasmanian Aboriginal people. The legacy of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people continues to be felt deeply in both cultural and political arenas, despite the tragic history of dispossession, violence, and the near annihilation of their people. The Tasmanian Aboriginal community has shown resilience in preserving and asserting their identity. In the 20th century, however, the belief that the Tasmanian Aboriginal people had gone extinct after the death of Truganini in 1876 was widespread among non-Aboriginal people. This perception was largely due to the absence of individuals of solely Aboriginal ancestry and a general unawareness of the surviving mixed ancestry populations, particularly those on the Bass Strait Island. Throughout the 20th and into the 21st centuries, there has been a significant shift in the recognition and awareness of Tasmanian Aboriginal people. Activists from within the community have worked tirelessly since the mid-1970s to broaden the understanding and acknowledgement of Aboriginal descent in Tasmania. Their efforts have not only helped to challenge the misconception of their extinction, but have also led to important cultural and political changes. One of the most significant milestones occurred in April 2023, when, after sustained campaigning by Tasmanian Aboriginal activists, UNESCO removed a document that had previously claimed the Tasmanian Aboriginal people were extinct. This removal was a powerful statement affirming the continued existence and identity of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. The struggle for recognition and rights has not been without its challenges, particularly within the Tasmanian Aboriginal community itself. A dispute exists over what constitutes Aboriginality, reflecting deeper issues of identity and heritage. The Palawa, who are primarily descendants of white male sealers and Tasmanian Aboriginal women who settled on the Bass Strait Islands, have been granted the authority to determine who is recognized as being of Tasmanian Aboriginal descent at the state level. This recognition is crucial, as it determines eligibility for government Aboriginal services. However, Palawa's recognition criteria have sparked controversy. They recognize only those who are descendants of the Bass Strait Island community as Aboriginal, excluding the Liaputa, another group claiming Tasmanian Aboriginal ancestry. The Liaputa assert that their descent is based on oral traditions and ties to mainland Tasmanian Aboriginal communities, yet they feel politically marginalized by the Palawa-controlled Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, which they argue does not represent them or their interests. The social organization of the Aboriginal Tasmanians was complex and multifaceted, with at least two distinct levels of hierarchy: the domestic unit, or family group, and the social unit, or clan. Each clan, which consisted of 40 to 50 people, had its own self-defining name and operated as a fundamental social structure within the broader community. The existence of a larger political organization beyond the clan level is a matter of debate. George Augustus Robinson, an early European observer who gathered ethnographic data in the early 19th century, described Aboriginal political groups only at the clan level. However, modern ethnographers and the Palawa, a contemporary Tasmanian Aboriginal group, often classify clans that shared a geographic region and language group as belonging to a larger national identity. Estimates of the total population of Aboriginal Tasmanians before European arrival vary widely, with figures ranging from 3,000 to 15,000 people. However, genetic studies have suggested that these numbers may have been significantly higher. This view is supported by oral traditions among Aboriginal people, which suggests that their population was more numerous than the white people were aware of. According to these traditions, population had been greatly reduced by a sudden outbreak of disease before the arrival of Europeans in 1803. It is speculated that early contacts with sealers, who arrived in Tasmania before the formal colonization, may have introduced an epidemic, drastically reduced the Aboriginal population. While the archaeological record does not clearly indicate a population as high as 100,000, some researchers argue that this figure cannot be dismissed outright. This argument is bolstered by data on the carrying capacity of the land, which suggests that Tasmania may have had greater resource productivity compared to the mainland of Australia. Such productivity could have supported a larger population than traditionally estimated. The potential for a larger pre-contact population underscores the rich and varied environment that the Aboriginal Tasmanians inhabited. Their ability to thrive in different habitats across Tasmania, from the coastal areas to the drier central lowlands and even the rugged western interior, suggests a deep understanding of and adaptation to their environment. The idea that Tasmania could support a much larger population than previously thought challenges earlier assumptions about the scale of Aboriginal society on the island, and invites further investigation into the social, cultural, and environmental dynamics that shaped their way of life. The Aboriginal Tasmanians were primarily a nomadic people whose way of life was intricately connected to the rhythms of the natural environment. Their movements were dictated by the seasonal availability of food, which included a diverse array of resources, such as seafood, land mammals, native vegetables, and berries. As they traversed their lands, they engaged in a variety of social interactions, including intermarriage and conflicts, or wars, with neighboring clans. These interactions were part of a complex social structure that spanned the entirety of Tasmania, aligning the population into 9 distinct nations, each composed of several clans. Each of these nations consisted of 6 to 15 clans, with each clan made up of 2 to 6 extended family units, all of whom were related. The clans were not isolated. They ranged over specific territories within their nation's boundaries, but they also had elaborate rites and customs for entering the territories of other clans. These rites were crucial for maintaining peace and order among the different groups, ensuring that interactions between clans from different nations were governed by mutual respect and understood protocol. Among these nations, the Oyster Bay, or Palawa, was estimated to be the largest, comprising 10 clans with a total population of around 700 to 800 people. Palawa people had a complex social structure and a well-defined territory that they managed according to the changing season. In the spring and summer, they migrated inland to the high country, where they found plentiful game such as kangaroos, wallabies, and possums. In the autumn and winter, they returned to the coast, where they could take advantage of the abundant seafood, seals, and birds. This seasonal migration allowed them to maintain a varied and nutritious diet throughout the year. The Palawa also had notable relations with neighboring nations. They enjoyed friendly ties with the Big River Nation, with whom they would gather in large numbers at favored hunting sites, both inland and along the coast. However, their relations with the North Midlands Nation were mostly hostile, reflecting the complex and sometimes contentious relationships between different Aboriginal groups in Tasmania. The high country, where the Palawa armies spent their spring and summer months, was not only a rich hunting ground but also a center for trade. Here, they could exchange goods such as ochre, a valuable mineral used in ceremonial practices, with other nations, particularly those from the northwest and north regions. Additionally, they harvested intoxicating gum from the Eucalyptus gunnii, tree that was unique to the plateau, further highlighting the rich resources available in their territory. The Northeast Nation, consisting of 7 clans with a total population of about 500 people, also had well-defined territories and social structures. Their relations with the neighboring Ben Lomond Nation were positive, with mutual agreements that allowed for seasonal access to the rich resources of the northeast coast. This cooperation ensured that both nations could benefit from the natural abundance of the region without coming into conflict over resources. northern nation, composed of 4 clans with a combined population of 200 to 300 people, had a unique and vital resource within their territory. Most important, ochre mines in Tasmania. These mines were so valuable that they were accessed via well-defined roads that were meticulously maintained through controlled burning. The ochre they mined was a significant trade item, exchanged with nearby clans for other goods and resources. Part of the year, the northern nation would spend time in the country of the northwest nation, where they hunted seals and collected shells from Robins Island, which were then used to make necklaces. In return for access to these coastal resources, the Northwest Nation was granted free access to the ochre mines. The Big River Nation, one of Tasmania's Aboriginal nations, was composed of approximately 400 to 500 people, spread across 5 clans. Little documentation exists regarding their precise seasonal movements, but it is believed that 4 of the 5 clans traveled through the territory of the Oyster Bay people, along the Derwent River, to reach their coastal camps near Pittwater. This indicates a reciprocal relationship with the Oyster Bay people, who were allowed similar access to the Big River territory. The North Midlands Nation inhabited the Midland Plains, a significant geographical area characterized by its formation in a horst and graben valley. This region had also experienced previous major freshwater lacustrine inundation, resulting in a relatively flat and fertile landscape. The richness of the land supported a large biomass, making it a crucial food source for the Aboriginal people. Although the North Midlands Nation likely consisted of several clans, ethnographic literature today describes 3 major clan divisions. Estimates of the total population of the North Midlands Nation vary, ranging from 300 to 500 people. The Ben Lomond Nation was made up of at least 3 clans with a combined population of around 150 to 200 people. Their territory surrounded the 260 square kilometers of the Ben Lomond Plateau. The clans of this nation were nomadic, hunting along the valleys of the South Esk and North Esk rivers, their tributaries, and the highlands to the northeast. They also ventured onto the plateau during the summer months. The Ben Lomond clans maintained close relationships with neighboring clans from the East Coast and North Midlands, allowing them to enjoy seasonal foraging rights in these adjoining territories. The Northwest Nation, with a population of 400 to 600 people at the time of European contact, was composed of at least 8 clans. The Northwest people had established good relations with the Northern Nation, granting them access to the resources of the Northwest Coast. The Southeast Nation, which may have consisted of up to 10 clans and around 500 people, controlled a region containing Tasmania's most important silkrete, chert, and quartzite mines. These resources were crucial for tool-making and other daily activities. However, the Southeast people had a notably hostile relationship with the Oyster Bay people. Raiding between these 2 groups was common, with the Southeast people often conducting raids to kidnap women, indicating a level of conflict and tension that contrasted with the more cooperative relationships seen among other nations.